Okay. Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of HLF Online. On my own behalf and on behalf of my co-directors Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I have great pleasure in inviting to our session Michiel Baas. And Michiel, of course, has written this wonderful book called Muscular India. And this is what we are going to discuss this evening. But before I do that, let me quickly make an announcement about the next session, which will be on the 18th of September, 15 days from now. And we will have the well-known writer Perumal Murugan in conversation at HLF. This will be on 18th September. And he'll be speaking about his latest book, Estuary, along with his translator, Nandini Krishnan. And this evening, of course, ladies and gentlemen, we have Michiel Baas. And those of you who have received our invite would have read his bio. I'll just mention a couple of things. Michiel is an anthropologist by training, and he has a Ph.D. from University of Amsterdam. And he has written extensively on the Indian middle class, migration, and both student migration as well as migration of professionals to places like Australia and Singapore. And Michiel also has held several academic positions in Nalanda University and in the National University in Singapore. And so thank you, Michiel, for joining us this evening with us. And congratulations on your very highly readable book, Muscular India. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who have not had the opportunity to look up this book, very quickly, this is a book on, this is a study. This book is a study of post-liberalization of India, post-liberalization India, post-1991. But Michiel reads the post-1991 India through the lens of, through the prism of a new body culture among men that seems to have given rise to proliferation of gyms and personal trainers. And Michiel draws interesting parallels between the aspirations and the frustrations of this new middle class and the speed at which India post-1991 wants to grow, or at least aspires to grow, and the roadblocks and the speed breakers that it encounters on the course of its growth. So there he draws very interesting parallels between the aspirations of a new middle class and a new India post-1991. I hope that's a fair summary, Michiel. And Michiel, thank you, as I said, once again for joining us this evening. And I would like to begin at the very beginning. How did the idea of this book kind of originate? Was it something that you thought you would write as a book from the beginning, or did it grow out of the various academic articles that you wrote on fitness and on bodybuilding among Indian men? So how did you conceive of this book?
Well, thank you again. Thank you for the warm introduction, also for having me. I guess the answer is a little bit both. I've been interested in new middle class formation in India for a couple of decades now, probably even as early as 1997, when India celebrated 50 years of independence, and international magazines at the time were really trying to understand how India was developing. And you might recall that around this time, actually, the IT industry became more of a prominent thing to associate with India. And I was really, as a student of anthropology, very interested in how that particular thing was experienced by young Indians on the ground. And I've conducted various research projects over time. The fitness industry per se wasn't always naturally my interest, but spending a lot of time in Bangalore and being invited by friends of the IT industry to visit them on campus, I would often note on how different these IT companies could be from basically the rest of Bangalore. And I do recall, and this was around 2002, 2003, that there were always gyms involved in these companies. And that stayed in the back of my mind because I hadn't seen them anywhere else in urban India. And then, of course, that started changing. And the way I usually work as an anthropologist, I pick up on change. Like if at first you start casually noticing it, then you start thinking, wow, it's interesting actually how present this is in public space. And then you start wondering, what is this actually about? And I think a turning point really came for me with two movies that I also talk about in the book, one being Om Shanti Om and the other being Gajini, because both of them were so highly visible, highly focused on the body of its authors. And that led me to this research topic.
Yeah, we will talk. I mean, I'm sure you had lots of fun, or at least from the way I read the book, you seem to have lots of fun watching so many films in Hindi, Tamil, Telugu. The number of films that you mention is amazing. And, how lucky to have to be watching films to write a book. Lovely. But before we come to the films, I just want a few basic things out of the way. As you would know that in India, we always had this tradition of akharas and vyamshalas and pehlwans. And how is this body culture that you talk about in post-91 India, how is this different from the traditional bodybuilding exercise and that entire culture?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and I've been thinking about it a lot too, because on the one hand, global working out culture has been highly influenced by Indian versions of working out. Obviously, the kind of workouts that you see in the akhara with the joris and the other, the kind of sort of strength-related workouts that people do have influenced workout cultures elsewhere as well. The tradition in India is incredibly old. But when you look into current day fitness culture in India and you look at the men who work at gyms, you see that there is only a very tangible connection with these akharas. And in fact, especially in the north, a lot of the more traditional akharas are actually being refurbished as gyms now because young men are no longer that keen on that particular health ideal or the whole ideal that surrounds pehlwani wrestling. So in that sense, it differentiates quite a bit also when it comes to the shape the body takes in ideal terms. Whereas if you look at, for instance, a pehlwani wrestler, or you see that his diet is heavy on ghee and almonds and milk and other such products. And in the end result is a much more bulky, muscular body than the average guy who now goes to the gym would go for. If you think of Om Shanti Om, I just mentioned it earlier, and what Shah Rukh Khan showcases in that movie, it's a very lean muscularity. That is traditionally not what the Indian wrestler ambitions for itself. So there is definitely a change, and of course, fitness is far more widespread currently in India than akharas ever were.
And also, is there a difference in the class that is associated with akharas and gyms?
Oh yes, absolutely. As I show in the book also, the kind of thing that lures clients to the gym is a bodily ideal that is particularly popular among upper middle class professionals. That's also how it's framed in movies. That's also how the way the Men's Health magazine puts it on the cover. It associates it with professionalism, with cosmopolitanism, with all these kind of things that, akharas are very far removed from. So where, the research I did in NCR, there you see the most concrete connections between all the forms of working out, especially among Gujar and Jat communities who historically have been far more involved in wrestling than other communities have. So there you do see a connection to a certain degree, but also there, one thing I noticed is that the younger generation doesn't necessarily look towards akharas as their future. They're far more involved in actual fitness and to a lesser extent professional bodybuilding competitions.
Mm. In your book, you mentioned 3 films and 1 magazine, as something that has influenced the new body image of the new India. So please tell us these, how these films seem to either capture or influence the changing self-image of the young people.
Yeah, I think what is crucial, and I talked about this a bit in a recent article with Times of India as well, and people were actually engaging with that quite a bit because everybody has their own recollection of Bollywood, Hollywood, Tollywood movies that one way or the other are have heroes who are either very manly, very sporty, or action heroes. So it's not that these were the only movies. I believe they were the most crucial movies because each of them did something different. And the Salman Khan movie was probably the earliest example where an older generation of fitness trainers really thought like, oh, this is possible with my body. So all the trainers and all the bodybuilders that I interviewed all pointed at the Salman Khan movie. But for middle-class Indians, probably Om Shanti Om was far more important. The deal was really so sealed with Amir Khan's depiction of the leading character in Ghajini, where, and especially because Amir Khan had undergone such a tremendous transformation. And transformation was something that would soon become key to Bollywood movies. So increasingly, the male stars in Bollywood movies have a separate line next to their own movies in terms of the transformation they've gone through themselves to portray a particular character. And I firmly believe that Amir Khan has really set the tone for this, and he's continued doing that, showing that in one movie he'll be your average next door hero, and in the next he'll be an extremely muscular character. And this transformation itself is very appealing because that's exactly what gyms do and gyms promise. You go to the gym to be transformed, not to stay the same.
And also, I was while reading your book, I was wondering, I think how one character or one actor like Amir Khan, and also because he is known to be Mr. Perfectionist, and how in 3 different films, his body shape is so different. For instance, you mentioned Ghazni, and then of course, then you have Lagan, where almost throughout the film he is shirtless. But that's a different kind of a class that he represents there. And then in the more recent film Dangal, again he represents a completely different idea of a pehlwan, of a wrestler. Right.
You know what the interesting thing with Dangal is, right? That he was actually a fairly slim and muscular man himself, but he chose to become and portray the older and bulkier version instead of the younger version first. So he took the whole narrative upside down, and that's become something that is basically a signature for every movie.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the word transformation as a kind of a recurring motif in this entire exercise of physical fitness, etc. So I was wondering, what does this, what do these bodies really convey? These transformed bodies, do they convey health? Do they convey aggression? Do they convey hyper masculinity, or do they convey discipline? What do they convey actually?
Yeah, I think they convey a multitude of things. I think what we're led to believe as consumers at large, as people who deal with our own bodies, is thinking that they represent health. Of course, in practice, that's a very difficult thing because a lot of these bodies are actually the product of fairly unhealthy habits. So they're not just about health. A lot of them are probably health gurus. As trainers, they'll be able to give you advice on diabetes, on your diet, on gaining strength, on becoming more mobile, which are all very important things. But when you look at the way the body is framed in magazines, in particular, you see a Men's Health, which has stopped publishing a few years ago, did so in particular, is that all these bodies are also associated with all sorts of other things, which hasn't actually anything to do with the muscular body per se. One of the things is professionalism and control. So you see a lot of this is framed as a body that is able to withstand the caprices of overconsumption. You know, this is a body that has figured out how to deal with all that lovely snack food in shopping malls. It's also the kind of body that radiates control in terms of a more professional way. It's a body that has figured out how to stay in shape faced with all the demands of modern life, long working hours, commutes, etc. So you see that the framing of the body goes well beyond mere aesthetics that are attractive or healthy. It's also associated with all sorts of other matters that I guess are on people's minds in India when the country itself is going through an albeit mercurial trajectory of economic growth. But obviously in the past 2 decades that I've been coming to India, the cities have changed tremendously. Air quality has changed, but also commuting time and all sorts of other aspects of life in India has really, really changed. And I guess this body is also a showcase, a way of saying, listen, I'm in control of all this. I understand how this works. And so it becomes the new capital. Besides economic capital, it's something that you can showcase to your friends, to your family, in the work floor, on the work floor, etc.
Yeah, you use a very fetching term, bodily capital, in the book. And we will come back to that particular phrase and another very interesting phrase that you use. But I want you to also tell us a little bit more about whether this self-image of the Indian male, whether there is a kind of a reversal of male gaze involved here. Because we are all familiar with the objectification of the female body in magazines and magazine covers, etc. And of course, they were all, the consumers, of course, were always men of these, women's bodies. So now, from being objectified, are we seeing a reversal of the female gaze here? The men's bodies being objectified, but for whose eyes?
Yes.
Right.
That's an excellent question. For who is this body meant? For which gaze? I think less so than you see with women working out or being models in fashion, where the gaze itself, the audience is male. The reverse is not so true when it comes to these muscular bodies. So within the gym, with lifestyle magazines, with fashion endorsements, in a sense, the audience is assumed to be male as well. So it's mainly a male gaze that gives shapes to this this new bodily shape, this new bodily ideal. That doesn't mean that women don't find that shape attractive. Of course they do. I mean, there's a reason for wanting to look like that. Perhaps there are also some biological reasons or framing reasons, but yes, of course, women look in that direction as well. But the way it is framed and the way it's showcased is very much keeping in mind that men are looking at other men in terms of the way that body looks. And that has a lot to do with what people also read in it in terms of masculinity and successfulness and all these kind of things that men find important. So what this body doesn't tell you much about is how this person is going to be a caregiver or a family man, or how this person even is going to be a lover or supporting you in your career if you're a woman. None of that, this body cannot be read in those terms. This body is primarily one that competes with the bodies of other men.
So is this the body of a self-assured, confident, the complete man?
Hmm.
Is that what the body is conveying?
Yeah, I think so. Partly it is. Of course, that is, in a sense, also skin or muscle deep. So I discuss that as well in the book. That doesn't always hold up to the practical reality of how such bodies are made. But yeah, I think in terms of the framing, and you can see the same in movies, the adulation these bodies receive, very different from the kind of adulation that a female body receives. So in a movie, a female body is almost always appreciated for its sexual potential, to be very blunt about it. A woman is found to be attractive and desirable. The male body, in that sense, functions differently. It's, of course, also reflected on as desirable, and in terms of sexual terms, and on top of it, it's reflected on in all sorts of other terms as being strong, warrior capacity, or even professional or otherwise. So it's a densely layered vehicle for all sorts of expressions. And that sounds enormously academic. I fully realize that. If you want me to unpack that a bit, go ahead.
But also, I just wanted you to reflect very briefly on the relation between muscularity and masculinity, and how do they connect? Is it, because you discuss in the book how, for example, we have had these he-men heroes in at least Hindi films. Dharmendra is a very well-known example.
Absolutely, yes.
And his son Sunny Deol is famous for his dialogue about a 2.5 kilo arm and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But what is this new awareness about the body itself becoming a spectacle?
Yeah, well, in terms of masculinity, so from the outset, I guess people find it very natural to assume that the muscular body is also immediately a masculine body. But you need to understand, masculinity is all about dominance within male ranks. It builds highly on the idea that men look at other men and then decide who is the alpha male. Not a very academic term, but often employed. The idea of, who is the leader to follow. And I guess that is often equated with the muscular male in the room because he's seen to be the most powerful, the most domineering. But what I try to do in the book is move a little bit away from that immediate association and also show that masculinity is a very complex thing. And what we appreciate about masculinity and a masculine self-worth is often the result of all sorts of factors that can be quite complex. So one thing you see, for instance, is that bodybuilders, while they sport incredibly muscular bodies, they're not necessarily, they haven't necessarily internalized that masculine self-worth because they're very dependent on family to support them in their sports. Remunerations tend to be low, prize-winning money tends to be low. It's a very uncertain place, and it certainly doesn't allow you to take care of your family or to start a family even. And as such, masculine self-worth, at its core is often about aspects that these masculine men cannot fulfill and have trouble kind of engaging with. And they might be looking up to their clients who are overweight IT professionals, but who do have all these kind of tools in hand to tick the masculine box. So it's quite a complex thing, and it's not easily captured just saying, oh, muscular body must be a masculine person or otherwise, self-secure.
Yeah, as you discuss in the book and also in a way dissect the masculine body and the muscular body in the book, I also was wondering how you in a way unpack this idea of a healthy mind in a healthy body, and also how, for example, gyms and working out is often seen as stress busters, but in fact they themselves seem to be, in at least in some cases, the those who create that stress. And particularly in your second, I think, chapter 2, you talk about the suicide of one of the
Yes.
trainers, which sounded so topical, to me, against the background of Sushant Singh Rajput's suicide and all that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this whole idea that we always believed in, that a healthy workout is actually one way of a healthy mind, but that doesn't seem to be the automatic case in many of these cases.
Yeah. The two sides to this. On the one hand, of course, the use of steroids, growth hormones, and otherwise have a severe impact on mental health, which is probably complicated by the fact that so much of this is about bodily self-worth, about looking at yourself in the mirror and thinking, am I good enough? And we're all surrounded by imagery these days that reminds us that our bodies are not the standard, even though most of us are either skinny or overweight like me, or not particularly fit or otherwise, but certainly most of us do not sport bodies as this exalted, idealized norm. For bodybuilders, what you see is that is further aggravated by the fact that on stage they're often not even remotely the biggest guy in the room. So a lot of men resort to steroids and growth hormones to be competitive towards competitions, using diuretics, doing extreme diets. Now that whole thing put together often creates a situation where it's quite easy to get depressed. Both because of the supplements, the stuff you use, and the very fact that it's a very difficult trajectory to achieve. So there is one side of this thing where you see that just equating all these muscular bodies with healthy bodies or mentally healthy bodies is quite complex. Of course, this doesn't go for everybody, but certainly not, for instance, for Kishore in the first chapter, who's typically a very self-made fitness guy who's never used a drop of anything in his life. But I think when you look at the second chapter where I described the suicide, this has less to do with the body itself and far more with the kind of opportunities you're given in New India to just do what you want to do. So the choices you get to kind of map out your own career trajectory. This considered person from a South Delhi business family whose father very much wanted him to join the construction business as a manager, and where he would be able to make a lot of money. But the guy himself didn't want to do that. He wanted to be a fitness trainer. He wanted to carve out his own career trajectory. And in the end, he just met with too much pressure, and he couldn't handle that anymore. So part of the book tries to kind of interrogate what is possible in New India. What kind of do you have to carve out your own trajectory, to walk your own path? And almost all the men in this book are self-made men. They've all decided at some point in their lives to do something else than their fathers ever had. And that in India is quite significant.
Yeah. And since you mentioned the names of some of the characters that you write about, one quick question: are all these real names, or have you used alternative names? Or
no, they're all anonymized, so people close to them might know who they are. The reason I did that was very simple. Of course, these men are very proud of their own trajectories, so most of them actually said, just use my real name. But you'll find that most chapters have people in them that don't know each other. So it's almost like you put people in a room together and you don't tell them each other's names, and they're expected suddenly to occupy that room together and to share a history. And they don't, because in certain chapters, I navigate from Chennai to Bangalore to Delhi. So they're all anonymized, but they themselves, of course, all know what I've written about them.
Okay. So on that, I was wondering whether you ever had a dilemma about the form that this book should take, whether you wanted to write a kind of a purely academic book, because you kind of alternate between academic theorization, and then, but most of the book is telling the stories, as if life stories of many of these. So did you have a kind of a problem in deciding on the form that this book should take?
No, well, this is, for me, at least as an anthropologist, the preferred way that I write in. And what I do usually in between is I continuously remind my informants that, of course, I will be writing an article or a book about this at some point. And if they want, I'll share the snippets with them to see how they are portrayed and if they're comfortable with that. The form of it, the book, well, of course, these things develop organically. At some point, you start writing and then you realize that it's taking you in a certain direction. That said, the kind of sort of the questions I always had with while writing was I representing the people I'd met over the years and who had become friends in such a way that I was doing justice to their stories, to their life histories, without losing also track of the fact that not every aspect of their story needs to be represented positively.
Yeah.
So I'm not writing, what do you call it, like a book that needs to give you hope. It doesn't have that agenda. But I did feel like my task on hand was to represent stories of new middle class, lower middle class men who often don't find themselves in a book. And if they do, it's usually quite in a stereotypical way. And that's the one thing I really wanted to avoid.
And in almost all the chapters, you kind of juxtapose two different stories. Kishore and Vijay, Manish and Ravi, Victor and Akash. So, this is a very interesting method in which you try to compare and contrast two different characters. So was this again something that you chose deliberately to tell your story?
It's always to me, it's always a very organic process, usually because I take quite a bit of time before I even start writing on any person that I've met throughout my career as an anthropologist. So usually I follow around, like Kishore was a person that I've probably known for 10 years. And it was only then that I thought there was this moment at the final day for judge and at Ganesh Chaturthi that I thought, oh, this is something I need to write about. Now it all comes together. And it's usually that process that I go through when I sculpt a chapter that I think, oh, wait, this reminds me of this story. And then suddenly, rather organically, these things come together. Of course, with Vijay and Kishore, this is a very clear matter of a one-day happening on the final day of Ganesh Chaturthi, where we take this gigantic idol from Chembur to Dadar, and me being quite familiar with Mumbai's layout, it kind of helped me also to tell the story of the suburbs, the neighborhoods these men traverse every day when they go and meet clients at Malabar Hill or Andheri West or Bandra West, Andheri East, etc. So, and that's how I started. I always knew I was going to tell the one story that is in the second chapter, which is set in a small Delhi gym in the south of Delhi, because it was a gym I used to frequent and I knew all the regular clients and trainers there. And of course, there was this incredibly painful moment when one of the trainers, who himself was from an upper middle class background, committed suicide. And it was quite a challenge to find the right way to write about that topic, because obviously it's a deeply personal story. It's a painful story. He was also my friend, was also somebody that I was close to and who I admired and had hoped the best for. But at the same time, the story also showed me that, the complexities of finding their own way in modern India. And in that sense, I took it step by step. But the assignment I always gave myself is to move away from the stereotypes and not to think in terms of, like, if I'm going to write about steroids and growth hormones, I can now tell the story of people who lose their way in that and overdo it. Or I can also show how difficult that choice really is and how that still comes with a strict diet and lots of workouts and lots of money concerns and all sorts of other things. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in the process of writing, for example, you take us through the lives of these men in Delhi, Chennai, uh, of course, Bombay, and also Bangalore. But I think one conspicuous absence is Calcutta or Kolkata.
Yes, I know.
And how did that happen?
Well, obviously, I'm a persona non grata now in West Bengal, in Kolkata in particular. I think I need to stay away for at least 5 years. Um, um, no, I mean, it wasn't a very conscious choice at all. The research just brought me to different places.
Mhm.
um, because I was able to stay in Delhi as part of Nalanda University for quite a bit. That allowed me to do research in Delhi. Then in a second research phase, I was based in Chennai. Bangalore tends to be my home in India for a variety of reasons. Mumbai is a city that I've been coming to the longest. I know Kolkata actually quite well, and I've lots of friends there, but research just never took me there. But I do know a lot of Bengalis say, well, kind of bodybuilding culture started here. There are lots of stories here too. So maybe in a next book, I should actually, bring that out. But you'll find that I've had conversations with, for instance, Ronald Joyce Sen about this, who's written about this actually in his fabulous history at play. Um, yeah, there's so much more work to be done on this topic. So
Mm.
I every Bengali in the room forgives me for not touching and knowing that I'm well aware, but I had to make difficult choices.
Mm. And you were talking about how these men um, also, apart from their investment in their body, also
Hmm.
have to invest in their packaging. And
Yes,
very often you talk about English language being the best packaging material. Uh,
yes.
so, and how important is that entire process of presentation of the trainers and
Yeah.
this new middle class that you talk about?
I often call it paradoxically crucial because it's often not necessary. It's performative.
Mm,
English in India is often performative. In the South Delhi gym, people would generally be very happy to be speaking in Hindi or Punjabi. So there was really no need to speak English at all. Still, trainers and clients seem to prefer it. And I often give this anecdote as an example that in a parallel research project, I did research among coffee baristas at Starbucks. And at some point, I was just nurturing a coffee at one of the sites of where the coffee was being made. And I overheard this woman ordering a skinny latte, something, something, probably a tea variety, because in the north they don't drink much coffee. And the girl behind the counter was desperately trying to understand what she wanted, but she'd been instructed to do this in English.
mm,
Hear the woman putting in her order in English, where she was clearly more comfortable in Hindi or Punjabi. She was probably Punjabi. And the girl behind the counter similarly, but the whole thing had to have happen in English. And English then becomes a marker, something, a threshold that needs to be crossed to perform middle classness. And I've often found that English, in that sense, is one of these things that really separates the new and what is considered lower middle class and the upper middle class. And as I show in the book, the difference between the newer lower middle class and often vernacular middle class is much less about money and much more about social and cultural capital.
mm,
And English is a crucial factor in social and cultural capital. So if you want to differentiate yourself from the two, you want to kind of showcase that you belong to a certain strata. English is very important. And of course, that has a lot to do that families of upper middle class backgrounds not only have a history of middle classness, of belonging to the middle class, but also have a history of attending English medium education.
mm,
So it sets you apart from all those newcomers to middle class ranks who are not that well versed in these things.
mm. Yeah. So, and another question that I was thinking was, this new muscularity or muscularity that we are talking about, how does that relate to the kind of muscular nationalism that we see not just in India, but see somebody like Putin, who very often is shirtless and very macho, and then you have our Trump, who always emphasizes. Yes, and of course we have our own prime minister talking about a 56-inch chest. So, how does this sit with that, this kind of a muscular nationalism that we have?
Well, you have this famous documentary by Anand Patwardhan. I think it's called in English "In the Name of God," where he shows that there's this kind of sort of Hindu revivalist movement that likes to equate themselves with bodybuilders to showcase that Indian men Hindu men can be muscular too. And there are linkages to be drawn with colonial days, I guess, where this was also something that the British instilled Indians with. There were certain martial caste and the Muslims who were muscular and the rest were considered effeminate, non-muscular, etc. I must say, I mean, I touch upon all these discussions in the book, but I'm also slightly critical of them because it's not my experience among trainers at all. Just the other day, one of the bodybuilders whose accomplishments I've been following for a while was very clearly, as a Hindu man, reaching out to his Muslim friends by celebrating a particular festival. And in general, that's been far more my experience than the other way around. So yes, I think maybe in symbolical terms you can think about it, because you can also see how, for instance, Hindu gods have been increasingly endowed with bigger muscles.
Yes.
There's this famous example, for instance, from a few years ago during Ganesh Chaturthi in Mumbai. There was, you could actually get on, instead of doing donating money or candies, this temple was asking you, it was actually in a shopping mall. You could go on this home trainer, you had to cycle really hard, and that actually endowed Ganesha with a six-pack abs. So it was kind of sort of a 3D imagery. It was a gimmicky thing, but so that's been around. But the people I've interviewed have actually always celebrated diversity, and I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that already they had to deviate from expectations of their communities, of their parents. They're all self-made men. They've had to map out their own trajectory. They've had to take risks, so they're less susceptible to thinking that they need to be a certain way. So they're already deviating. So they are usually the types who are the first to come online on social media and celebrate a Christian or a Muslim holiday, or to speak out, for instance, for sexual minorities around issues of LGBTQIA 377. I've seen a lot of informants of mine do that without actually having been pushed in that direction. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that they are so well aware that they are considered different.
And since you kind of touched upon this, I was also wondering whether this kind of this flexing of muscle is a kind of a post-colonial reassertion or a response to the colonial characterization of the colonized, and particularly of Indians as weak and effeminate, and this is a kind of a getting back at them. Is it a kind of a conscious reassertion of the masculinity?
Yeah, again, I think it's a complex thing. I think we tend to sort of focus on the past, where it concerns men who are really not that, preoccupied with this past per se. One anecdote that I think is always, I once interviewed at the time founding editor of Men's Health India. And when the first Men's Health came out, the Indian edition, it had a cover model who was not a known model. And it came with the byline that Indians can have abs too. The moment the came out, and it was a runaway success. Men's Health India belonged to the India Today group at the time. One of the leading figures of of India Today called up this chief editor and said, "Why did you use a foreign model? I thought we were going to do an Indian edition." And the founding editor had to explain, "But listen, this is an Indian model." And here you can see that, you know, the leader of the India Today group couldn't imagine that this was an Indian man. So I think a lot of our analysis also, you know, kind of sort of funnels this idea that indeed Indian men are not this. But for the men I interviewed, it was always very self-evident that they could achieve this. So some of them, of course, would refer to akhara and India's ancient traditions in terms of working out. Others had long let go of the idea that this was a new thing and had been doing it for years. But the colonial past matters very little to them. I mean, that's a thing that very, very peripherally might have some resonance with their own daily lives, but this is not something they think about. I think it's mainly something us academics tend to think about and want to frame in that light, but to them it doesn't matter at all.
And sorry.
I would suggest it, they would probably do this, and it's like, what are you talking about now? So, you know, it would be very unlikely to resonate with their own experiences.
And since you talked about deviating from stereotypes, one of the interesting things that I found was, you know, where you talked about the society on steroids. That's a beautiful phrase that you use. And of course, what really surprised me was the way in which you, in a way, dissociated the gyms with the stereotype of being gender, you know, insensitive, etc. In fact, you say that the space, the workout space, the floor space in gyms are highly gender sensitive, and actually the women find, you know, relaxed. You know, women find it very relaxing that they have come to a place where they are respected and they are treated, you know, equal. Yeah, tell us about the atmosphere within the gym as far as gender relations are concerned.
Yeah, to come back to the first thing you said, society and stereotypes. I think gyms kind of present us with a counterweight to all of that. So they're places where you can work on all the excesses of society, and even though they play loud music and you have the constant clinking and clonking of weights, they can also be a breath of fresh air from far removed from the busy life that characterizes life outside. For the female clients I interviewed, of course, they share concerns over, you know, who provides them training with, how they are reflected on in the gym. But I would often also say that within the gym, the trainers are exceptionally mindful of all that. And that has to do with the fact that, you know, they have female colleagues, they have female clients, their certification courses talk about gender-related issues. But I think, again, the most important thing is the fact that these men are already self-made men. So they've already had to revisit all sorts of beliefs that they've grown up with. You know, they didn't decide to follow in their father's footsteps. They didn't decide to do what might be expected from their caste backgrounds. They're already moving out of their mohallas, their neighborhoods, their gullies, etc. They're already traversing across the city to high-end gyms and making their way into spaces that none of their peers have ever done the same with. So these are also typically the men who reflect critically on all sorts of other assumptions about who they are supposed to be. And of course, women are another example of that. Female clients, female trainers, female colleagues. So I do believe they're often far more mindful of these differences, and they are definitely not, as you would assume the muscular bodies to be the aggressive male in public street. Of course, in practical terms, that's also not possible. Most of these men are very tired after working a day and working out. So they'd rather go home than do some, spend a couple of hours being bored and eve teasing. These are not a man we're going to expect on the street and be irritating at a bus station. These are men that go home and have to worry about their diets and eating their next 16 eggs.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Just one last question, and then we can move to the audience questions. I was wondering whether you have considered looking at another section of this phenomena, which is the female trainers. So is that something that you considered? Because they are also now, big time.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It was very limited when I started this research. It's been growing exceptionally fast in the last few years. The same with female bodybuilding. One of my long-term informants and friends, Rita Singh, has appeared with me in another show. She's one of India's most accomplished bodybuilders who has also competed internationally. And she will agree with me that the scene of bodybuilding has grown exponentially in India where it concerns participation of women. I think that's very fascinating because far more so than men, their bodily ideals deviate quite a bit from what people associate the ideal type woman to look like. So I think there's a lot of research to be done, and I'm actually very keen to see what is coming out the coming years from younger researchers who might find inspiration in this book and say, well, Michael has it all wrong, or Michael is right, but he hasn't really paid attention to this. And I'm quite keen to see what that kind of I see it also as a start of a discussion. I think that's going to be so fascinating, and I would love to see more research on female bodybuilding in India, for instance, and the kind of predicaments they deal with, going on stage, going off stage, convincing their parents, carving out an income out of all this. This is probably going to be one of the next big topics. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. And, I have a couple of more, but I think it's fair that we go to audience questions now. The first question that I see is from Giridhar Rao, who asks, what about an androgynous masculinity? Is that not an important thread in the discourse of masculinity as well?
Oh, wow, that's quite theoretical, and it really kind of depends what you read into it. Already there's a certain paradox between androgyny and masculinity, I guess. But if you look at K-pop, I think Korean pop music, which has now very recently been making its inroads into Western culture as well. You see men playing with a very different type of masculinity, which is far more androgynous, far less oriented towards power and masculinity as an ideal type. For instance, in South Korea, men using makeup as straight-oriented men is on the rise. So I wonder if that's how that will take off in India. I do know that in the Northeast that is becoming more popular, at least K-pop is. How that's going to appeal and figure out into kind of an Indian male sense of well-being and self-awareness, I have no idea. But I do agree. I mean, there's lots of interesting masculinities to delineate, to figure out, which are not necessarily all about big muscles. I mean, it's an ideal type. And as it goes with ideal type, they don't need to appeal to each and every one of us.
Right. And I think this is connected to the next question that has come in, which is partly already answered by you, but this is YL Srinivas, who is asking, isn't the current celebration of male muscularity in cinema and media a strategy to perpetuate patriarchy and thereby continue subjugation of the other sex, since muscularity is also a demonstration of power?
Yes, I think this is again sort of ironical because this is not the sense I get from fitness trainers and bodybuilders per se. When you look at certain of these movies, whether it be Ranbir Kapoor displaying his muscularity in a make-believe fairy tale setting in Gujarat, yes, I do think it really ponders to a particular idea of patriarchy. At the same time, this is not always how it lands in gyms. So we should not just think like, oh, just because Bollywood portrays it in a certain light, this is how people internalize it, and that means that everybody believes in that story. I believe people consume a lot of different media, and in India that's the case as well. So the moment people watch Bollywood movies, they might be confronted with a particular version of patriarchy, but then next they'll be tuning into Amazon or Netflix to be confronted with a very different version of that. So we need to take a bit more of a holistic approach. And it doesn't resonate with my experiences among fitness trainers and bodybuilders. And I think that's interesting how they still are able to make particular choices in this and relate to this differently. And often actually really upset notions of patriarchy where they have supporting female spouses or mothers who really support them in their endeavors and are well aware of the fact that they are in a dependent position.
Mm. Maya Pandit asks, are some so-called feminine qualities like taking care of children or showing love and sensitivity, etc., part of this new masculinity as against the old one?
Oh, very much. But see, when you interview a fitness trainer or a bodybuilder, of course, the focus in his life will always be the gym. But some of these men I've interviewed over the years, and they become family men as well. So their masculinities is very much tied to also being caregivers, being supportive of their wives, being caring towards their children. Does working out directly relate to it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer that because see what often happens is with our associations means that we think like, oh, these men must be in a certain way. Can these men still be family men? Can these men still love their children? Do lower middle class or labor class men love their children? These are not questions that you can answer based on a few case studies. Obviously, they do. And obviously, most of these men are hoping to start families and love their wives and love their kids and have lives beyond the gym. But I think what happens on social media is you see one aspect of that because that's the one that takes the foreground.
So the masculinity, muscularity has nothing to do with being uncaring and being
not at all.
Sensitive.
Absolutely not. No.
Nikhat Parveen asks, isn't the rise of Muscular India a business propaganda and also a way of setting standards, which has always been the case? And thus, it's not individual choice or desire, but a forced assertion.
I think same with everywhere. There is, of course, a neoliberal dialogue or influence at play that makes people think that if I have that kind of body, I'll be successful. It's another capital. I mean, it's for a reason that I use the term bodily capital because it isn't just capital in terms of the money you put in it. Don't forget, a muscular body is often very, very expensive to craft. And I give you quite a few examples in the book on how much it can cost to even build such a body and maintain such a body. But it can also be used as currency to negotiate your place in society. And India being at heart a capitalist society, like virtually any other society on planet Earth right now, yes, of course. Muscular India and how you matter and how you showcase yourself and who you are all aspects of that. There's no denying that. There's no other way of looking at it. But I think it also sometimes really originates from a personal wish to be a certain way. And I don't think that is always about money. The trajectories of the men that I interviewed don't always start with the idea like, oh, I can make a lot of money in New India. No, oftentimes they just had this desire from within to transform themselves in a certain way.
Yeah, the next question is from Ramakrishna. This is a long question, but I will just ask the last one sentence, which I think summarizes the entire question. Do you believe masculinity as biological or a cultural construct?
No, the latter. I think I think all of this, including gender, sexuality, and all that, is by and large the product of the societies we live in and the way it exists around us. There's now research that kind of shows how babies from and even earlier are confronted with notions of gender and sexuality around them through color, through toys, and otherwise. So obviously, yes, all of this, one way or the other, is part of a construction we started to believe in. One thing I always emphasize when I give public lectures, also at conferences, is that this whole idea of the perfect body is a construct. It hasn't always been that way. Among middle class men until recently, it was the healthy pot belly, and I must say I would personally do really well among that ideal. So and a lot of us would. Then it changed, and then it became about something else. So none of it is set in stone, and I don't necessarily believe that this will always be this new muscular ideal of lean muscularity will always be the ideal. Already you see in East Asia the emergence of a very different kind of masculine ideal, like harking back to the first question of androgyny, is far less explicit in terms of the archetypical manliness. So yes.
Nikhila H asked this question: what about the emotional landscape of these men? Is masculinity all about body image and performance?
No, not at all. I mean, of course, once you decide to be a fitness trainer and a bodybuilder, that's going to be the main thing in your line of work. If you were to be an accountant, would you hang up all your emotions to being an accountant? I don't think so. So yes, of course, a lot of these men do have a life beyond that. I guess the thing is, diet-wise and the focus you need to have to achieve a certain ideal does require a lot. Their emotional state of mind is bigger than that. A lot of them, of course, obviously have dreams like each and every one of us, to meet a partner, to spend your life with, to start a family, to build a house, to take care of your parents, to be self-secure financially, etc.
Yeah. Ravi Leherer asks, bodybuilding in our times is, as nerds in the 80s, was dismissed as something that guys do to compensate something they don't have, or the classic no brain, only brawn. Does this stereotype persist?
Yeah. I guess what we see in current day society is that you always have particular identities that take the forefront. I'm not sure if I would compare it that easily to geek or nerd culture, but yeah, it stands for something. You need to see the bodies not just for the physical reality of the bodies, but also what they tend to resonate with, what they communicate, and how they are perceived. They are bodies that are consumed and looked at by others, and they label it with meaning. See, the muscular body doesn't have much use in day-to-day life. This is one thing we always forget. Normally, the muscular body is only of use to people like my father, who worked on the land all his life and grew cauliflower, or people who work in construction or in the harbor and need to carry heavy things. But the muscular body per se, the way you see it in the gym and what middle-class men strive towards, has no use. It's a useless body in that it doesn't even necessarily mean it's a healthy body. It's an extreme body that is performative and that showcases something that you want to tell a story with. And I think we all do that. We all do that through our own identities, our own being. We try to communicate something of ourselves, and we try to be unique through our sense of dress. Maybe it's the shirt I'm wearing with the colors, or maybe it's the glasses you're wearing, or maybe it's something else, but we try to stand out. This is, of course, one aspect of that.
Michael, thank you for a wonderful conversation. I want also to end with asking you this question about, of all the people that you have interviewed, of the innumerable number of people that you have interviewed, and the so many stories that you have collected, I'm sure you have left out a few. But is there something that, one story of one particular character that you write about in the book that really stayed with you beyond the book? Since you mentioned at the beginning that you changed all the names, I was wondering whether the character or the story you write about Shivam, whether that's a real name, or whether that's again a name changed, because Shivam was also a participant at HLF a couple of years ago.
No. No. It's anonymized. So there's several. I find it very difficult to choose. So I'm going to choose two because they contrast also in a way. The one is in the first chapter, Kishore, because I followed him probably for the longest, and I find what he has accomplished as originally coming from Chembur, labor class neighborhood in Mumbai, really building a fitness brand of himself. Incredibly fascinating and rewarding. I must also say, as a friend that he turned out to be over time, he's been an absolute source of inspiration. The other person is probably a couple of chapters later, bodybuilder Victor from Chennai, who was initially an IT professional when I met him and became one of India's most celebrated bodybuilders. Again, an incredibly powerful story of a person who really decided to do something differently. And I think these two stories probably stayed with me the most, but all of them did one way or the other. It's very hard because, like you already said, I left out a lot. So the people you see in the book are actually all the people that really stayed with me. And that while I was writing it, emerged as people that I needed to tell that story. That story needed to be told. But there's so many others that I met along the way that didn't make the book, which I would have loved to include. But
Yeah, just a couple of last minute remarks from the audience. Bonnie Zaire is asking, the early magazine cover declaring Indian men have abs pushes back at the Indian engineer as nerd stereotype.
Yes, yeah. I know. Yeah. So what I'm waiting for is actually somebody to do a firm analysis of all the men's health that have come out since the magazine folded a few years ago for rather inexplicable reasons. I would love to know the answer why the magazine has disappeared from roadside stalls.
And YL Srinivas and Giridhar Rao are wondering whether the poster at the back on the wall behind you is that of a lady trainer, a woman trainer.
No, actually, I'm sitting in. So these are actually artworks from a friend of mine, Hong Kong-based artist from the Netherlands. And I'm just going to move my head aside.
Yeah.
And if you look at them closely, they're images from Hong Kong that unite billboards together with working life. So the muscular body in the back actually has, I think, what is called a half truck or something like that. So he often works with this kind of juxtaposition, but they have nothing to do with my work. So no, she's not a female trainer, I think. She's probably just a fashion model. And the guy on the other side is probably an underwear model. But in a sense, of course, what a lot of the male trainers that I met and interviewed over time hope for is to be discovered as models.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, for your patient
Thank you.
exposition of the book and answering the questions. Wonderful, and I'm sure this book, as you mentioned on your FB page, it's already it's already in the form of an audiobook.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, wonderful.
For all these people who are great listeners but don't like reading.
Yeah, and I think their numbers are more now. And I'm sure this book will do very well. And thank you once again for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of this evening's session. But before we leave, I just wanted to remind you that 15 days from now, we will have another online session, and our author would be Perumal Murugan, speaking on his latest novel, Estuary, translated into English by Nandini Krishnan. And they will be in conversation with Srilata, a poet and a professor from IIT Madras. So on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues, Ajay Gandhi, Amita Desai, and Kinnara Murthy, I thank you once again for joining us this evening. And I hope to see you back in 15 days' time on 18th September at 7 p.m. Thank you once again, Michael, and all the audience. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.